Just a digital signature here, Ms. Vance, the event manager whispered, offering a sleek tablet. I watched the stylus glide across the screen, authorizing the final six-figure payment for my sister Sophia's reception. The staff at the Grand Meridian had no idea that Isabella Vance, the reclusive billionaire who had acquired this hotel group 3 years ago, was actually Isabella Sterling, the woman my family had officially declared dead a decade ago. Through the gilded archways of the ballroom, I watched my parents, Arthur and Eleanor, holding court. They looked radiant, celebrating their only daughter's union while standing in a building I owned, drinking wine I had curated, and basking in a prestige I secretly funded. Under the cover of a lace masquerade mask, I was a ghost at my own family's feast. It was 8:14 p.m. Yet in exactly 48 hours, the Sterling shipping legacy would realize that the daughter they buried in an empty casket wasn't just alive. She was their new landlord. Before we get into how I dismantled their empire, I want to hear from you. Leave a comment below letting me know which city you're watching from and what the local time is right now. I read every single one of your stories, and I love seeing our community grow. Standing there, I felt like a glitch in their perfect reality. Arthur was raising a toast, his voice booming with a warmth he had never once directed toward me. To the world, I was a tragic memory, a cautionary tale of a girl who couldn't handle the weight of her name. To my parents, I was simply gone, a mess they had tidied up with a fake obituary. The Sterlings are such a pillar of the community, or the coordinator mused, oblivious to the fact that I was the one who signed her commission check. I watched my mother, Eleanor, adjust Sophia's veil with trembling, joyful hands. It was a tenderness I had spent 22 years starving for. Now, I didn't need it. I had built a skyscraper where my heart used to be. I wasn't just Isabella Vance, the mystery mogul. I was the personification of everything they feared. A Sterling who had succeeded without their permission. The fracture began when I was 22, fresh from finishing my degree in quantitative finance at Columbia. My father didn't want a partner. He wanted a pawn. He had brokered a deal to merge our shipping routes with the Thorne family by marrying me off to their eldest son, Julian. To Arthur, it was a strategic alliance. To me, it was a life sentence. When I proposed modernizing our fleet using data-driven logistics instead of mergers through matrimony, my father's face turned a shade of purple I'll never forget. The ultimatum was cold: walk down the aisle with Julian Thorne, or walk out of the Sterling house with nothing. I chose the latter. The next morning, I liquidated a $62,000 trust fund they had overlooked and vanished into the gray expanse of Chicago. I changed my name, my hair, and my life. But the Sterlings couldn't handle the scandal of a runaway daughter. It was cleaner for their reputation if I were a tragedy rather than a rebel. 6 months later, I sat in a cramped studio apartment and stumbled upon a post from my sister's Instagram. There they were, dressed in funeral black, standing on a cliffside overlooking the ocean. The caption read, "Saying a final goodbye to our beloved Isabella, taken by the Atlantic." They had fabricated a private plane crash to explain my disappearance. They hadn't just disowned me, they had performed a ritualistic execution of my identity to save their social standing. That was the day I stopped being a Sterling and started becoming a predator. To my parents, the Sterling name wasn't just a family, it was a blue-chip brand. In their world, a daughter who fails to comply is a liability, but a daughter who dies is a legacy. By declaring me dead, they converted their greatest embarrassment into a source of public sympathy. It was a masterclass in social brand management. They spent a decade conditioning Sophia to believe she was an only child, effectively gaslighting her into the role of the sole heir. This wasn't just about spite. It was about preserving the illusion of a perfect, unbroken lineage. They had invested so much in the lie that the truth became a threat to their very survival. They didn't mourn me. They mourned the version of me that served their interests. Watching them now, I realized they weren't evil. They were small. They were prisoners of their own prestige, unaware that the walls were finally closing in. The facade cracked during the third course. My mother, Eleanor, had always been a woman of iron discipline, but tonight, the combination of celebration and excessive gin had loosened her tongue. She stumbled toward my table, her movements erratic as she leaned in, the scent of juniper and funeral lilies clinging to her silk gown. "Miss Vance," she slurred, focusing on my mask with glazed eyes. "A woman like you. You understand? Meaning you built an empire from dust. You didn't wait for a man to give it to you?" She let out a laugh that sounded like glass grinding together. "My Isabella. She thought she was like you. She thought she could defy Arthur and make it on her own. But a sterling girl without her father's name is just nothing." I felt the temperature in the room drop as she leaned closer, oblivious to the fact that her nothing daughter was currently paying for the very gin she was spilling. "We had to tell everyone she was gone," she whispered, a twisted pride in her voice, "to protect the family name. We gave her a beautiful service, but she didn't even deserve the mahogany of that casket. She was a failure. Not like you." I gripped my glass so hard I feared it would shatter. "And what if she had succeeded, Eleanor?" I asked, dropping my cultivated accent for just a second. The familiar tone of my voice made her freeze, a flicker of haunted recognition crossing her face before the alcohol reclaimed her. "What if she became the woman you're currently begging for an investment?" By 6 a.m. the next morning, the lace mask was gone, replaced by the sharp lines of a tailored power suit. I sat in my glass-walled office overlooking the harbor, watching the sterling cargo ships struggle against the tide, slow, rusted, and obsolete. "The wedding finalizes at $415,000, Sloan, my chief of staff, said as she swiped a set of data visualizations onto the main screen. "All of it put on high-interest credit lines. Arthur is literally betting the house on Sophia's new husband saving him." I looked at the glowing red numbers. The Sterling Empire wasn't just crumbling, it was a hollow shell. "And the quarterly report? Worse than we projected," Sloan replied. "They've hit 18.4 million in losses. They've mortgaged their primary warehouses to a shell company they think is a Swiss bank. It's actually us. We now hold 72% of their total debt." I leaned back, a cold satisfaction settling in my chest. For a decade, I had been the silent scaffolding holding their world together, waiting for the right moment to pull the supports. "Instruct Aegis Logistics to terminate the preferential shipping rates we've been giving them. From this moment on, they pay market price, plus a 15% legacy surcharge. That will bankrupt them in 14 days, Sloan noted, her voice devoid of pity. "Then we have exactly 2 weeks to prepare the funeral for the Sterling name," I said. "This time, the casket won't be empty." I arrived at the Sterling building at 10 a.m. sharp, dressed in a midnight emerald silk suit that looked more like armor than fashion. Around my neck, I wore my grandmother's silver signet ring on a delicate chain, the only piece of the family I still claimed. The lobby was a temple to 19th century arrogance, but the air was thick with the scent of a dying beast. Employees scrambled, sensing the shift in the atmosphere as I bypassed the reception desk. "The board meeting is strictly confidential, Ms. Vance," Arthur's secretary stammered, trying to block the elevator. "Privacy is a luxury the Sterlings can no longer afford," I replied, my voice echoing like a gavel. I pushed open the heavy oak doors of the 14th floor boardroom. 12 men in charcoal suits sat around a table that had once felt like a tribunal. At the head sat my father, looking every bit the defeated king. He looked up, his face hardening as he saw the woman from the wedding. "Ms. Vance, this is highly irregular," he snapped. I didn't say a word. I walked to the head of the table and slid a sleek encrypted glass drive into the central hub. A massive data map projected onto the wall, highlighting every Sterling asset, the ships, the docks, the family estate, all glowing in a predatory red. "You're looking for the source of your debt, Arthur," I said, leaning over the table. "You thought you were borrowing from offshore banks to keep your legacy afloat. But those banks are subsidiaries of Aegis Logistics. I didn't just disrupt your roots, I bought your life. I own your warehouses, I own your offices, and as of midnight, I own the roof over your head." My father's hand shook as he stared at the screen. "Who are you?" I leaned into the light, letting the signet ring swing forward. "I'm the ghost you tried to bury, Father, and I've come to collect the interest." The boardroom transformed into a sinking vessel. Men who had spent decades sneering at upstarts were now scrambling for their phones, realizing their pensions were tied to a ghost. My father didn't shout. He simply slumped into his chair, the weight of the emerald suit I wore finally registering as a symbol of the wealth he had failed to gatekeep. "You're burning the house down with us inside," he whispered, his voice cracked. "I'm not burning it, Arthur," I replied, standing tall. "I'm just changing the locks. You have 18 hours to sign the merger agreement. If you don't, I liquidate every asset by dawn. Your choice." As I stepped into the lobby, I found Eleanor waiting. She looked as though she had aged a lifetime since the wedding. She tried to reach for my arm, her eyes searching for the daughter she had erased. "Isabella, we did what we had to for the Sterling name. We thought you were destitute." "You thought I was weak," I corrected, pulling away. "You chose a fake funeral because you couldn't imagine a world where I succeeded without you." "Well, look around, Mother. I didn't just survive. I won." I walked toward the glass doors, leaving her standing in the shadow of the empire I now held by the throat. The lobby of the Sterling building was a sea of flashing bulbs and shouted questions. I stood behind a sleek obsidian podium, dressed in graphite gray, looking every bit like the future that had arrived to dismantle the past. My parents sat in the front row, forced to attend the public execution of their biggest secret. 10 years ago, I began, my voice amplified and steady. The Sterling family held a memorial for a daughter they claimed was lost in a tragic accident. They stood by an empty grave and told the world a lie to cover up the fact that I had simply chosen a different path. The room went deathly silent. I looked directly into the lens of the main camera. "My name is Isabella Sterling. For the last decade, you've known me as Isabella Vance. I didn't return to seek revenge. I returned to prove that tradition without innovation is just a slow, expensive suicide." I detailed the merger, the total absorption of Sterling shipping into Aegis Logistics. I watched my father's face crumble as I explained that every board member, including him, was being forcibly retired. He wasn't just losing his company, he was losing his pulpit. As the press erupted, my sister, Sophia, pushed her way to the edge of the stage. She looked pale, her wedding glow replaced by a mask of horror. "You were there," she whispered, her voice caught by the microphones. "At the wedding. You watched us cry over your memory." "I watched you perform," I corrected softly. "You were 12 when I left, Sophia. You were old enough to ask why the grave was empty, but you were too comfortable being the only child to seek the truth." She flinched as if I'd struck her. Beside her, my mother was a ghost, her social standing evaporating in real time. The only daughter narrative was dead. The perfect Sterling legacy was a fraud. "The new Sterling Aegis group will move forward," I told the reporters, led by the daughter who was supposedly too rebellious to lead. "The old guard is officially dismissed. The ghost has taken the helm." I walked off the stage as the room dissolved into a frenzy of headlines. Behind me, the massive portrait of my great-grandfather seemed to loom over a family that no longer owned the floor they stood on. The dust settled in the weeks that followed, but the landscape was unrecognizable. My parents didn't fight the merger. There was no strength left in them to resist. I allowed them to remain in the Sterling manor, but the deed was now tucked safely in an Aegis logistics vault. They were guests in their own history. Living on a stipend I authorized every Tuesday morning, I saw my mother one last time before I moved my operations back to Chicago. She looked fragile, stripped of the jewelry and the social armor that had once made her feel invincible. She tried to offer an apology, something about protecting the lineage, but I simply handed her a list of the hotel's new management protocols. I didn't want her regret. I wanted her silence. I had achieved the ultimate victory. I had made them irrelevant. They were no longer the architects of my pain. They were just two people living in a house owned by a ghost. They say blood is thicker than water, but I've learned that truth is stronger than both. My family tried to bury me to save their reputation, but all they did was plant a seed that eventually grew to overshadow their entire world. If you've ever been told you weren't enough, or if you've had to walk away from a toxic situation to find your own strength, hit that like button and let me know in the comments. Have you ever had to cut ties to save your own future? I want to hear your stories below. And if you're ready for more stories about turning betrayal into an empire, make sure to subscribe and turn on notifications. You're part of this community now, and your voice matters.